welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. It's been another poor salmon fishing season on Alaska's Yukon River. Once one of the world's richest salmon fisheries, the numbers of returning Chinook, chum, and coho salmon don't reach the minimum threshold to open even Alaska native subsistence fishing. Arguments abound over the causes and solutions to the river's dire situation, and native voices are struggling to be heard. We'll get an update after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. A case is ongoing in Wisconsin over a legal challenge to key permits for a project to reroute an oil and gas pipeline around a Lake Superior Tribes reservation. As Danielle Kading reports, Canadian energy firm Enbridge wants to build a new stretch of its Line 5 pipeline.
Enbridge proposed the reroute after the Bad River Tribe sued to shut down the pipeline on tribal lands. Now the tribe and environmental groups are challenging the state's decision to issue a wetland and waterway permit, among other approvals for the project. They say the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources lacked baseline data about the project's effects on wetlands. At the first hearing, Bad River Tribal Chair Robert Blanchard said a potential spill could spell disaster for the tribe's homeland.
It's going to affect our way of life, and that's why we are fighting this so hard.
Enbridge spokesperson Jennifer Smith said they designed the route to minimize harm.
We believe that the Wisconsin DNR's permits are accurate, they're correct. We can build this pipeline with minimal environmental impact.
The reroute would cross nearly 200 waterways and disturb around 100 acres of wetlands. Supporters say it would create 700 jobs, but opponents question the company's environmental track record. A DNR attorney says it properly permitted the project under the law. For National Native News, I'm Danielle Kading.
Efforts in New Mexico have been relaunched to find about 150 tribal items stolen in 1984. Earlier this year, a bowl stolen from the Santa Ana Pueblo Ceremonial Village was returned. Monica Morell, director of the Santa Ana Historic Preservation Department, says that led investigators to look for more leads on other items.
We have right around a dozen objects that we have very close connections.
Items that are at least a century old are considered antiquities and protected under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. And in 2022, Congress passed legislation prohibiting the export of items held sacred by tribes. Tributes continue to pour in for Canadian Indigenous actor Graham Greene. He died on Monday of natural causes. He was 73. As Dan Karpinchuk reports, for many critics, Greene had a groundbreaking career.
Greene was an Oneida from the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario. Among those who paid tribute to his work was actor Kevin Costner, who described him as a master at work and a wonderful human being. It was with Costner that Greene was nominated for an Academy Award for the film Dances with Wolves. Costner posted one of his favorite scenes from the movie when Greene played the part of Kicking Bird, a Sioux medicine man.
Tatanka.
Tonka.
Here. Tatanka.
Dances with Wolves was his big break, and Greene wasn't going to look back.
I'll be damned if anybody's going to push me off this heap. I'm going to fight as hard as I can to stay there and get more writers, more actors, more storytellers, more film crews. Anybody in the technical end to seriously get on board.
And that followed with several roles in movies and television. The Stratford Festival in Ontario also paid tribute to Greene, who played Shylock in the 2007 production of The Merchant of Venice and Lenny in John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. Greene was also honored with the Governor-General's Performing Arts Award for Lifetime Artistic Achievement. Governor-General Mary Simons said he brought dignity to every character he portrayed. She said he broke barriers for Indigenous actors and opened doors for future generations. And we honor his extraordinary contributions, she said, to Canadian culture and celebrate a legacy that will resonate across Canada and beyond. For National Native News, I'm Dan Karpinchuk.
And I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Support by AARP. AARP creates and connects people to unique tools and programs, helps conserve personal resources, and tackles issues that matter most to individuals, families, and communities. More at aarp.org.
Support by Drummond Woodsum, a full-service law firm whose nationally recognized tribal nations practice provides services to tribal nations and their enterprises and to companies that do business with tribes across the country. More at dwmlaw.com.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. Salmon that return to Alaska's Yukon River are in trouble, and there is no easy fix. Organizations representing Alaska Native subsistence and commercial fishers are working to make their voices heard as the multitude of jurisdictions identify causes of the problem and develop potential solutions. For the 6th year in a row, fish and wildlife officials imposed severe restrictions on Yukon salmon fishing. Overfishing, commercial trawlers, bycatch, and climate change are among factors experts point to for plummeting numbers of king, coho, and chum salmon in what was once among the world's richest fisheries. There's little agreement on what to do next. Today, we'll get insights from a variety of perspectives. We also want to hear from you, our many listeners. You can join this conversation with a comment or a question. 1-800-996-2848 is the number to call. That's also 1-800-99-NATIVE. You can also comment on our website or social media pages like Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads. Let's now meet today's guests. Joining us from Fairbanks, Alaska is Janessa Newman. She is the Indigenous Stewardship Director for the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission. She is Koyukon, Athabaskan, and Inupiaq from the native village of Rampart. Good morning, Janessa. Welcome to Native America Calling.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Also joining us from Fairbanks is Jasmine Vent. She is the Indigenous Communications Director and Acting Administrative Assistant for the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission. She is Inupiaq and Koyukon from the village of Huslia. Jasmine, good morning to you as well, and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Joining us from Anchorage, Alaska is Holly Carroll. She is the Yukon River Federal In-Season Salmon Manager for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Holly, good morning and welcome to our show.
Hi, grateful to be here. Thanks very much.
And joining us from Valdez, Alaska, we have Serena Ahlstrom. She is the Executive Director of Yukon River Drainage Fisheries Association. She is a Yup'ik of Androfsky tribal member from the village of St. Mary's. Serena, good morning and welcome to our show.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I'm pleased to have all of you on the show today. Thank you so much for taking the time to educate our listeners. And Janessa, I want to begin with you. What is the best path forward to revive salmon populations in the Yukon?
Well, there's a lot of ways to answer that. I think the most encapsulating way to answer that is really just Indigenous stewardship, really taking a holistic look at the decline. I mean, there's not, like you said, it's really complicated. There's not one single answer or like aspect of the decline we can just press a button and answer, but I think Native stewardship, just the perspective of Native science, it comes from very holistic, and we live out there every day. We see things in real time, and generally Native stewardship, Native-led management.
Mm-hmm. At the beginning of the show, during the intro, we used the term bycatch. Can you explain more about what bycatch is and how serious is that among the different threats to Yukon salmon?
Bycatch is really a drop in the bucket of the lots of different things. I mean, bycatches in the federal fisheries, it's not the federal fisheries is primarily focused on groundfish, so pollock in the trawl industry, and bycatch of salmon is just what they're not intentionally targeting. They're not even really legally allowed to benefit from it financially, like they don't get to sell it. So they have to just get rid of it. It gets thrown off overboard. So that's what people that this is fish wasted that we don't get to see, and they don't even get the chance to make it back to the rivers because it's caught unintentionally in these trawl fisheries.
Okay. I want to ask you one more question, then I want to bring Jasmine into the conversation. And Janessa, you stress the importance of native stewardship. And there is research that shows warming water temperatures are severely harming fish, making them more vulnerable to disease. What can native stewardship and other stakeholders do about that challenge?
I mean, it's really difficult to directly address warming waters, but I think, one way that native stewardship can, help alleviate other stresses, again, this is indirectly, but one thing some tribes are doing is trying to clear up the anadromous streams, trying to make it a little easier for fish to get back to their spawning grounds. Yeah. Like
What goes into that?
A lot of indirect.
Okay. What goes into that cleaning process to make that trip easier for the fish?
Well, I mean, there's sometimes beaver dams in the way, so fish have a extra obstacle to get over. Sometimes these streams have lots of hanging trees. They're like smaller streams, so they have trees that are hanging over and starting to block them. Some have been kind of redirected with, different water flows with kind of in the spring, water in the spring. Yeah.
Okay. It sounds like a lot of time and a lot of hard work. Thank you, Janessa. Jasmine, let's talk about an agreement that exists with Canada to restrict fishing in the Yukon. Is that improving the challenges that we're talking about facing salmon populations?
I don't know if I could speak directly to that on whether it's improving or not. But what I can say is that our fish commission, the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission, was created so that tribes and First Nations along the river could come together and speak with one voice to protect our salmon and our way of life. And within that 7-year moratorium, a lot of tribal voices were often left out of those decision-making processes. So we're still working on becoming truly united along the river, whether it's tribal organizations, federal and state agencies, and also working with Canada. But within that process, it takes a lot of time and trust. So the 7-year moratorium, I can't say whether or not it's improving or making the situation worse, but we're definitely still working on becoming united within that. And along with a lot of challenges like ocean fishing and climate change, we're facing a lot of growing threats from like industrial development. And I think why many tribes are calling for more Indigenous stewardship is so that we can speak with one voice. Because like you mentioned at the beginning of the episode, there's a lot of disagreement within these management practices or within these perspectives that within these challenges that we're facing. But we know that the strength of our communities lies in our shared knowledge and our shared connection to the river. So at the Fish Commission, we're really working to build a management system that reflects Indigenous values and real life experience. And we're pushing for co-management where tribes and First Nations in Canada have more than just a seat at the table, but prioritizing that shared authority and responsibility over the fish that have always sustained us.
More than just a seat at the table. That's such an important point to make, Jasmine. And I understand that your organization, the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission, it was created more than a decade ago because of this realization that Yukon salmon were disappearing. What do you count as your successes during that time, and especially with regard to stewardship? What have been some of the wins that we can talk about today?
So, yeah, the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission was founded in 2014 in the village of St. Mary's, and that was alongside the Kuskokwim River Fish Commission. Some of our wins, we are now 44 tribes strong from Hooper Bay to Eagle, and within that, united to protect Yukon River salmon. In March of this year, we are now a standalone nonprofit 501c3, and we are no longer under a Department in Canada Chiefs Conference. So we can really lean into why we exist, and that's to not only speak with a unified voice for salmon conservation, but continue to build a comprehensive management plan and establish true co-management. Because when our founders called for a unified voice, they weren't just asking us to be united, they're recognizing that together we already hold the answers. So since we are operating as our own organization now, another one of our wins was hiring our first employees, which was myself and Janessa. And we're really working to simplify complex fisheries information so that people on the river can make informed decisions, because oftentimes a lot of this information is shared, but it's so complex and condensed that, it can be really confusing at times. So we're really hoping to develop like a co-management framework that's transparent and accountable and can be really rooted in equity between the tribes and agencies. But yeah, I would say that right now our focus areas would be salmon rebuilding plans, advocating in different spaces such as the Board of Fisheries, Area M, and North Pacific Council, and strengthening our foundation as a tribal-led independent organization.
For the 6th year in a row, fish and wildlife officials have imposed severe restrictions on Yukon salmon fishing due to plummeting numbers of king, coho, and chum salmon. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Graham Greene had numerous TV and movie roles before he burst onto the international scene as Kicking Bird in 1990's Dances with Wolves. He remained a busy actor until his death this week in Toronto. We'll hear about Greene's contributions to the arts and Native representation by people who worked with him. That's on the next Native America Calling.
Support provided by Amerind. Amerind is 100% tribally owned and partners with tribes and their businesses to provide affordable commercial insurance coverage, protect tribal sovereignty, and strengthen Native American communities by helping to keep dollars in Indian country. Information about property, liability, commercial auto, and workers' comp available at amerind.com. That's AMERIND.com.
Thank you for listening to Native America Calling. Today we're talking about the various threats to salmon populations in the Yukon River in Alaska and ongoing efforts for restoration. Join our conversation with a comment or question by calling 1-800-996-2848. Alaska salmon fishers, I know you're out there listening. Give us a call. Tell us what you know about what's happening here on the Yukon River, or maybe you're a salmon fisher in the lower 48, a state like Idaho or Washington. You can join the conversation as well. 1-800-99-NATIVE. Let's now talk with Serena Ahlstrom. She joins us from Valdez, Alaska, where she is the executive director of Yukon River Drainage Fisheries Association. And Serena, experts warn about the dwindling number of salmon. What have you and the people you represent experienced over the years? What have you seen regarding the availability to catch fish?
Well, our organization has been around since 1990, and the people along the Yukon River were the ones that were ringing the bells at the beginning when they started seeing the decline of Chinook salmon. And so they wanted to have their voices heard when management decisions were being made, and they wanted to share their observations and knowledge.
Serena, have you ever seen a situation like this before where fish have been on the decline year after year?
Growing up in St. Mary's on the Lower Yukon, we've had we've been blessed with a lot of fish, and I've never seen the decline so low over the last few years. We never thought the fish would diminish this quickly and this fast in my lifetime, at least.
Now, you say growing up blessed with fish. Can you give me an example? And what did it look like in those days? What did the river look like? What was it like catching salmon in those days as compared to now? Like maybe just like the experience of what it's like out there.
Well, growing up, when I was younger, we never had restrictions on the river. Subsistence was open 24/7. If you needed fish, you were out there on the river. As the numbers started to decline, restrictions started being put in place for the communities along the river. Chinook salmon was the first to decline, and in the early 90s, in about 2009 is when they completely closed Chinook fisheries and had it open, very limited, if there was a good abundance. Mm-hmm. And then with the Chinook fisheries closing, we had to rely on chum salmon. And the abundance of chum was so great that we never thought it would close. And we experienced historic lows in, I believe, 2020, 2021, seen it fall below 200,000 chum, and no one was able to subsistence fish, and it was a shock to everyone on the river.
Serena, when you talk with your members, what do they tell you? What are their ideas for possible solutions to address the decline in these numbers?
Over the years, I mean, like I said, growing up on the river, fish was always a conversation around the table. And in these many meetings that I've been to, talking with local people, they want to break down these management silos. They want to manage to the life cycle of the salmon. Just to give a geographic perspective of the Yukon River, it's 1,980 miles long. You have many fishing districts along the river, so each area is completely different, which makes it really complex for management. And then they go out into the ocean and feed. And so there's other fishing districts out there that have their own management plans. And so it's very fragmented and very, they manage in their own fishing district. So a lot of people are saying, well, let's break down those silos and manage to the life cycle of our salmon, which completely makes sense.
Yeah, the way you describe it, and again, you just said nearly 2,000 miles, the length of the Yukon River, and competing interests of different communities and fishing operations. Extremely complex, obviously. Serena, do you have any optimism that this current trend can be fixed?
I have hope. I cannot have hope. It's ingrained in my livelihood. And I want my kids to experience what I experienced growing up. So that's why I'm working in this industry and trying to make sure that the salmon come back to our rivers.
Now, you mentioned and you talked about managing the lifestyle of salmon. That's been the approach. Is that the best approach? What's your thought on that? Or are there other ways to manage the salmon?
Well, manage to the life cycle of the salmon.
Life cycle. I'm sorry, the life cycle. Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay. The life cycle.
They migrate. Yeah, they migrate. They come into our rivers. They spawn at the headwaters. They migrate back to the ocean to feed and live for 4 to 7 years and return back. And when there's other fisheries that aren't being restricted, it presents a problem. It's like, living in a community and there's one well in the community and the water's running low. Are you just going to restrict one portion of the community to that drinking well? It's that kind of concept where we need to conserve what we have and everyone needs to share the burden.
So, Serena, when you have this multitude of various opinions and ideas and perspectives on what are the best solutions, how do you all come together? What is the process for getting all of these stakeholders on at least maybe not the same page, but even in the same chapter or something, just to get all of you folks just moving in the right direction? What's that process look like?
Well, our organization, we have a pre-season meeting where we have a representative from each tribe come together and talk about the upcoming season. I think expanding on that and having everyone at the table, because we can't, in my opinion, we can't exclude others from being at the table. We need North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. We need Board of Fisheries. We need the other fishing districts coming together, sitting down and hashing it out. And I think that's the only way it's going to get solved.
Now, what about commercial fishers, sport fishers? Where do they fit into this issue? And are there solutions that could potentially work for all these different parties?
Well, it's sharing the burden. We can't put restrictions on just the in-river users. Like I said before, there's other fisheries that either have bycatch or intercept our salmon in other fishing districts. So it's placing some restrictions on those other fisheries that don't have those restrictions put in place.
Okay, thank you, Serena. And Jasmine, I want to go back to you because there are different jurisdictions here. There's the state of Alaska. You have the federal government as well with regard to jurisdiction, with regard to some of these fishing waters. Do you think these governmental entities, Jasmine, do you think they fully grasp the severity of the problem we're talking about today?
No, they don't. I would say jurisdiction over fisheries in the Yukon is really complex. Like you mentioned, there are multiple agencies involved, federal, state, tribal, and within that, there's so many different rules and priorities. And within, how would I say that? Sometimes these agencies don't coordinate well, which makes it harder to protect the salmon effectively. And I think that's why it's so important for tribes and First Nations to have a stronger, more unified voice through co-management. And we're really working towards that. And I believe that when we share authority and work together, the decisions along the river can better reflect what's actually happening on the river and support the long-term health of not just the salmon, but our communities as well.
Okay. And Janessa, how about you? The Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission represents 40 tribes, Alaska Native voices. What needs to happen in order for these different voices, these different perspectives, these different viewpoints to be adequately included in these discussions about what happens next?
Yeah, so the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission, we actually represent 44 tribes. I think, obviously, co-management is necessary, but, before we can get there, I think there's a real need for people on the river really want management agencies to, take some accountability to recognize the role that they may have unintentionally played. I mean, I think people on the river, for all of my life, salmon have been declining, and I've heard the same conversations around the dinner table, like Serena said, all my life, really about, the fish are getting smaller, but we're still taking the same amount. Those kind of conversations. And these are things that people have been saying for a really long time and have been really asking management to take these things into consideration when they make their management decisions. And I think, owning that a little bit is what people on the river really want in order to have an equitable conversation where we're all starting from a place of the same truth, really.
All right. 1-800-996-2848. That is the phone number to our Albuquerque studio where our producers are standing by and they're waiting for your call. And especially people who are familiar with salmon fishing. If you're listening to the show right now and you're thinking, geez, you know what? I know what's going on in the Yukon River. I can talk about my community. I can share some of my experiences. I remember what it was like growing up when I would go out with the elders, maybe with my parents or my grandparents, and we would fish. And I remember what those waters were like, and I can see what they're like now, and I can see the difference. Share your story. Give us a call. Tell us what you know. The number, 1-800-996-2848. 1-800-996-2848. Let's talk now with Holly Carroll. She's in Anchorage, Alaska, and she is the Yukon River Federal In-Season Salmon Manager for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Holly, hello again, and thank you for joining the show. Can you tell us what is the federal government's position on what the main problem is impacting salmon in the Yukon?
Oh, that's a lot to unpack. Your other guests have really shared a lot of wisdom, and they've kind of touched on a lot of the threats. We have a lot of natural threats. One of the things that maybe hasn't been touched on yet that would be worth covering is, for our Chinook salmon, Chinook and summer chum, when they're coming up through the Yukon, they're experiencing heat stress, and to kind of compound that, we think they could be dying before they even get to their spawning grounds. But our Chinook have a unique problem with a disease called ichthyophonus, and that's a parasite they're getting from eating food in the ocean. And this parasite is in a lot of other fish and a lot of other salmon, and it doesn't cause the same kind of problems as we are seeing on the Yukon. So, we think maybe that's related to the very uniquely long migration our salmon have. And so we're doing a lot of effort to study that disease and then figure out if we can try to quantify what amount of en route mortality might be occurring so that as these runs do rebound, we make sure and account for that before we fish those, make sure that enough of them are going to survive and get to the spawning grounds. And then for our fall chum, we actually have some pretty tough natural spawning problems that are occurring for those guys. A lot of our fall chum are going all the way into Canada, and some of their spawning grounds, the First Nations folks have been telling us for years that their natural upwellings are drying up. So fall chum will be really unique. They'll be spawning in snow and ice, and they really rely on these, bubbling up springs to spawn in, and those are drying up. And we also had a pretty catastrophic natural event where a glacier a runoff into a creek in the Kluane River and lake completely dried up about 4 or 5 years ago. And that's having a huge impact on the Canadian run of fall chum. And that run used to make up a quarter of our fall chum. So, some of these things are going to be hard to reverse. We may not have the ability to kind of do something about that. And so, the ocean, we didn't really talk about kind of what's going on with the ocean. It isn't just that the oceans are warming, it's that the food dynamics in the ocean, because of some of that warming, is shifting completely. And so the quality food items that Chinook and chum need, they're not getting. And so they're smaller, they're weaker, they don't have enough gas in their tank to make it the super long migration that they need. That's, one of the reasons they're coming back smaller currently. And so, again, we just have a pretty poor food dynamic. There's other series about competition with hatchery fish. There's a lot of Russian and Asian hatchery chums out there in the ocean. And so if the ocean is not the best feeding ground for chums and Chinook, and there's also competition on those feeding grounds, it's just death by 1,000 cuts right now. But of course, all of your guests touched on the harvest. The harvest is the piece that we should be able to control. And so for us in river, my jurisdiction is just the Yukon River. And I think we have pretty clear levers of controlling the one aspect we can control, and that's harvest. And so that's why we've had the closures. One bright spot has been that the coho run came in much better than expected, and we have been able to allow fishing on that run. Unfortunately, historically, these coho, these silver salmon, they come in much later, and so they're not as much of a huge part of the cultural traditional diet of folks because they aren't as easily dryable when we have the bad fall weather. So even though we can provide some fishing on that species, we are still missing 170,000 fall and summer chum from the diet, and we are missing about 50 or 60,000 kings from the diet. And so, one of the problems we still have, I was just in a community last week, and I have people saying, well, if these fish are going to go, maybe we should fish them now. We don't have food. We don't have grocery stores. So our biggest problem is still trying to make sure that people know that we need to let them go by and recover.
Okay. All right. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back and continue this conversation.
More than a museum, the Alaska Native Heritage Center represents all Alaska Native peoples in a living cultural center where the traditions, languages, and arts of Alaska Native peoples come to life through cultural programming and exhibitions. Life-size village sites, live performances, demonstrations, and dynamic exhibits are all just minutes from downtown Anchorage. Open 7 days a week, there is always something new to discover at the Alaska Native Heritage Center who support this show. More at alaskanative.net.
We're glad you're with us today on Native America Calling. We're hearing about the troubling decline of salmon in the Yukon River and current efforts to turn those numbers around. You can join us with comments and questions at 1-800-996-2848. Our guests today are all in Alaska, and they're speaking about issues on the Yukon River with regard to Alaska. But there is salmon fishing in the lower 48 as well. I'm thinking about anybody who's listening to the show right now who might live there along the Columbia River. Maybe you are in Idaho. Maybe you are Nez Perce. Maybe you're in Oregon and you fish the Columbia River, or maybe you're in Washington. We'd like to hear your perspectives as well with regard to salmon runs and what's happening in recent years with regard to factors and issues that are reducing their numbers. So you can give us a call, 1-800-99-NATIVE. Let's hear from some listeners today. Let's get some calls going. 1-800-996-2848. On the line right now, we have Holly Carroll with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And Holly, before break, you mentioned the harvest as one tool that authorities have to address this issue. And I want to ask you, this current strategy right now of limiting the fishing season year after year, is that going to work? Is that sustainable long term in terms of getting this harvest where it needs to be?
Yeah, so one of the things I try to explain is that, as these runs have really poor production, so that's the amount of replacement these salmon do. Are they going to put some eggs in the gravel and replace themselves by one fish, or is it going to get it back up to 4 fish? We're going to need that productivity to increase. And to do that, we need to get a certain number on the spawning grounds. We are seeing very, very poor escapements right now. We're not meeting escapements. The example is we've had about 24,000 Chinook salmon make it to Canada. A more appropriate biological number would be 70,000. So it's really important that we don't fish the ones that come back to us in the river. So it would definitely make a difference if we fished those runs and none of them made it to spawn. And so it's essential that we continue to keep the in-river harvest low until they become fishable, until those run sizes are exceeding escapement goals. And I think that's the toughest part, because people need to eat today, now, and they have been conserving for 5 years and longer. We have all these people standing down, stepping away from their food source, their main food source, and their cultural traditions. And that's working, that's essential, but it is hard to keep up that long-term conservation, that long-term sacrifice, when you see that inequity that some of your other callers have touched on, that there are bycatch harvests occurring in the marine commercial environment. And so that's kind of the trouble we have, is that, yes, we absolutely have to continue to keep harvests on these returning fish low enough to be sustainable, and that should make a difference, but there's more work to be done outside of our rivers like they're talking about.
Holly, you used the term escapements a couple of times. For our listeners who might not be familiar with salmon fishing, can you explain that concept in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, so, like the other participants have described, our salmon, they come all the way up the Yukon River, so they'll migrate the 2,000 miles. They lay their eggs in the gravel, and then those young are going to migrate all the way back down the Yukon and out to the ocean. Then they're going to live to be adults in the ocean, we hope. They're going to spend years out there foraging. And then they're going to come back in, and they're going to go all the way back to their home stream, and they're going to spawn and die. And what we call escapement is the number of fish that make it to those spawning grounds to successfully spawn before they die. And we call it escapement because they are escaping through a gauntlet of fishing. There's fishing in the river, subsistence, and there used to be commercial in our river, a very healthy commercial industry in the Yukon. And then they're escaping all of those marine fisheries and predation out in the ocean. And so essentially, if they make it home to spawn, they've escaped a lot.
Mm-hmm. I've been visiting a funnel, and then just right, they just keep being reduced, right? It just keeps lowering and lowering, and then years. This is fascinating. Right. Holly, you mentioned earlier that some of these declines, they're happening in selected places, but not others. And like we've talked about, this is a river that is nearly 2,000 miles long. It is a very, very large river. Is there any easy way to explain why you're seeing these declines in these selected places, but not others?
Well, I think, to use a phrase you used earlier, it's lifestyle. The salmon that are coming to the Yukon have one of the longest migrations in the world. Whereas the salmon sort of going to the Kuskokwim or the Norton Sound or even Bristol Bay, those have shorter migrations. And I use lifestyle because the sockeye, for instance, are booming. It's just record run after record run. Now, their life cycle is way different. They're going to spawn in lakes. They're going to rear in those lakes. And then when they go out to the ocean, they're eating different foods. And so whatever's going on with our climate and the ocean right now that's really hurting our Yukon fish, those other fish, and including pinks, are thriving. So their life cycle, their sort of genetic approach to their lifestyle, if you will, is really serving them well right now. And for our Yukon fish, it's just not serving them well. And a lot of people will talk about a thing that salmon have been doing for millennia, and that is straying. If things are not working out for them, there's a certain proportion that will stray to other rivers, And our hope is that these salmon will be resilient. They've been around for 1 million years. Our Yukon fish will adapt. They're adapting to warmer temperatures if they can adapt fast enough. Some of them will stray. But if they stray outside the Yukon drainage, that doesn't help our people who want to eat them, And so, one of the toughest things I think we have to face is, like, we as humans also need to adapt, that we may not see those 1 million chum runs and those 400,000 king runs again. We may have to adapt that this is the genetic bottleneck. This is where we're at. But if we can nurse them along, like we are seeing the fall chum and the summer chum runs just almost meeting goals. So if we continue to stand down on fishing, they might get better and they might recover. We've seen it happen in 2000 when they crashed before, and we had record runs after that.
Holly, when you mention the straying and the idea that some of these fish along the Yukon, they could migrate to other rivers, and what I'm hearing here is it's a very real possibility maybe that the Yukon just won't be the source for salmon that it once was. And I'm curious, what role do subsistence fishers have in this discussion if this is just the reality going forward with the Yukon and these other fish in these other waters become the priority?
Well, I think the role has already been discussed. I mean, all of your participants have really hit the nail on the head. If the users of the Yukon, the native indigenous stewards, are not 100% involved in the future of these fish, we aren't going to adapt to what it is. And there's differing beliefs. I think there's some people that want to rebuild them to the sizes they used to be and believe that's possible. And I think there are those that are saying we have to adapt to losing these. I mean, if you talk to First Nations people in Canada, many of them stopped fishing these fish decades ago. Our folks on the Yukon don't have that immediate replacement for food, and so we are quickly having to pivot and adapt to other fish like non-salmon. We have about 1 million whitefish species that go up the river. Those traditionally have not been fished in summer, but people are finding ways to use them as a food source, as a replacement for salmon while we're in this low productivity period. And my hope is people will continue to find those adaptations and just kind of steward these fish along until we can bring them back. I see the fall chum and the summer chum as coming back. They're already working on that. I think the Chinook is a longer road.
Thanks, Holly. Let's go back to our guests from the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission. And Jasmine Vent is on the line in Fairbanks, Alaska. She's with this organization. And Jasmine, we just heard Holly mention that we might be at a crossroads for Chinook salmon. Is that a possibility that your organization can adapt to?
I guess what I can say is it's really important to understand that the salmon counts, the escapement goals, most of the data used to make these management decisions are controlled by state and federal agencies, not us. Tribes and First Nations aren't the ones deciding when fishing opens or closes or how many fish are quote unquote enough. But we are the ones living with the consequences when those decisions don't reflect the reality on the ground or in the river. And I think that's why co-management is very important and matters. We need a system where Indigenous knowledge is respected alongside all of this Western science and where our communities actually have a say in this decisions that impact our fish, our food, our future. We don't know what's going to happen, but what we're trying to do is make sure that this burden of conservation doesn't just fall on the people who live along the river, and that's our communities. We're the ones who are told to stop fishing, to make sacrifices, to do our part, even when we've already been doing that for years. Meanwhile, the bigger impacts from ocean interception, bycatch, and industrial development often go unaddressed, and when we do try to address them, the blame gets pointed at in-river users as if we're the primary problem. But the truth is, our communities have always been the first to notice when the fish are struggling and the first to take action. And we've been trying to spread this message for the last 30 years. We're not the cause, we are the caretakers, and we really just need a management system that reflects that reality and holds everyone accountable, not just us. So I hope that kind of answers your question a bit. We are adapting with these times right now, but it's something that we're forced to do. This is our reality, and it impacts every aspect of our lives.
All right. Janessa Newman, also with the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission. Do you have anything to add from what we just heard from Jasmine?
Yeah, I just want to stress that, yes, I think everyone realizes we are at a crossroad. Everyone on the river realizes this. But we're also just people who have, one, adapted our entire existence, but we're holding on to hope. There's no other way to go forward, but to continue to fight for the salmon because no one else is going to fight for them but us.
All right, thank you, Janessa.
Yeah.
All right, Serena Ahlstrom, back to you with the Yukon River Drainage Fisheries Association. Serena, what's next? What is the next opportunity you have to contribute to a possible solution here?
Well, our organization will continue to sit at the table, attend meetings where management's being discussed, really empower our people to let their stories be heard. Let them talk about the impacts of losing the opportunity to harvest their salmon. We're resilient. We're resilient people. We've had many issues over our lifetime for our grandparents and our ancestors really hold us up to fight, to keep on fighting for our well-being and our livelihood, to pass it along to our children. And I think that we, just like Jasmine and Janessa, are talking about, that we have to be there. We are the ones that are going to be fighting, and I don't see myself stopping until I can have my kids pulling the salmon from the Yukon River.
And Serena, how do you make that happen? How do you keep the fight going? How do you insert your voice for better representation in the process?
Well, like I said, attend these spaces where the decisions are being made, and unfortunately, that's with the state and the federal government, providing input and insight. And I think, like I said earlier in the shows, that all of us have to be present at the table. We have to have Indigenous voices. We have to have our community leaders, the fishery managers from state and federal, everyone sitting at the table to discuss the issues, and not only in river, but we need those managers that are at the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, at the Board of Fisheries, to really understand the crisis we're in, not only for our salmon, but for our livelihood as well, because that also takes a huge impact. And we're just hitting the surface of the crisis.
Serena, you mentioned wanting to do this work, wanting to bring these salmon back for future generations, for your children, for your grandchildren. The young people in the communities that you represent, do they understand what's at risk here, what's at stake, what the future looks like?
In every community trip we go to, we encourage young fishers to attend the meetings, and there's and I could only use some of my experience as well with my kids. I have twins that are 13 years old, and they weren't able to cut salmon. They weren't able to traditionally cut their salmon. My oldest daughter, 16 years old, she was beginning to learn how to cut salmon and get the net ready and throw it out. And then that was the only year she did that. Growing up, I just wish that my kids could experience everything from, cutting fish and watching the grandparents cut fish and being at the table to do that on their own.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. We're going to have to wrap up this conversation today. But I would like to thank our four guests who joined us: Jasmine Vent, Janessa Newman, Holly Carroll, and Serena Ahlstrom. Please tune in again tomorrow as we take a look at the life and legacy of iconic First Nations actor Graham Greene. Hope you'll join us. I'm Sean Spruce.
Program support by the Colorado Plateau Foundation, a native-led foundation supporting native-led initiatives protecting lands, waters, and cultures of the plateau for generations to come. The Colorado Plateau Foundation helps to build networks, community, and organizational capacity. The Colorado Plateau Foundation is accepting grant proposals through September 5th. Eligibility information is available at coloradoplateaufoundation.org. Support by AARP. If someone asks you to buy gift cards to pay off debt, it's a scam. Imposters will claim your Social Security number's at risk, or your utility company will stop service due to late payments, or you won the lottery and only need to pay some upfront costs. They'll say the fastest way is to buy gift cards and share the numbers on the back. Anyone who tells you to pay a debt with a gift card is a scammer. More information on gift card scams at aarp.org/giftcards.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.